A Thursday morning in late October. Mist curling through a valley that didn't appear on any map worth reading. The kind of place where roads turned to gravel, and gravel turned to dirt, and dirt turned to nothing at all. Cressfield. A name that meant nothing to anyone with power, and everything to the woman who had chosen it as the place to stop existing. At 20 minutes past 5, the most feared man in 4 territories stood at the end of a narrow stone path. His breath hung visible in the cold air, his coat too fine for a place like this, his shoes darkened by mud he hadn't noticed stepping through. He was staring at a cottage. Small, ordinary, half hidden behind an overgrown garden that looked like it had been loved into wildness rather than neglected. Smoke drifted from the chimney. A light glowed behind thin curtains. He heard her before he saw her. Not her voice, but her movement. The soft creak of floorboards, the quiet rhythm of a life that had learned to begin before the world was watching. Then a smaller sound. Quick footsteps, lighter, uneven, the way small feet move when they are still learning how. The front door opened without warning, and everything he had built inside himself over the past 4 years, every wall, every controlled breath, and every carefully maintained silence, collapsed. She stood in the doorway, haloed by warm light, wearing a knitted pullover with sleeves pushed past her wrists. Her auburn hair was shorter than he remembered, her face thinner but steadier, like time had carved away everything that was not essential and left only what could survive. She was not the woman he had left behind. She was someone else entirely. At her side, a girl stood with one hand gripping the edge of Revka's sweater and the other holding a small wooden horse. Her hair caught the light from inside, auburn like her mother's, but her eyes— He stopped breathing. Gray. Pale. Sharp. Unmistakable gray. His eyes. His exact eyes set in a face so small and soft they looked borrowed from another world entirely. The girl tilted her head and looked at him the way he had looked at men across negotiation tables, without fear, without flinching, like she was deciding whether he mattered. Behind Revka's legs, half hidden, a boy watched him. Darker, quieter, nearly invisible in the shadow of his mother. Dark hair pressed close to his forehead, warm brown eyes that carried none of his coldness, but the way he held himself, still and measured and perfectly controlled, was something no child should have known how to do. 2 children. His children. The realization came all at once, violent and absolute. His lungs refused to work. His vision narrowed until there was nothing in the world except the 3 of them standing in that doorway and the 4 years of silence that separated him from everything that mattered. Revka. Her name left him before he could stop it. Rough and fractured, stripped of every layer of authority he had ever built around himself. Her expression did not change. No surprise, no relief. She looked at him the way you look at weather, something that arrives whether you want it to or not. You need to leave. The girl tugged at her mother's sleeve. Mama, who is he? His chest cracked open. He felt it happen. Sharp and irreversible, like bone giving way under pressure it was never designed to hold. Nobody, Revka said, smoothing the girl's hair without looking away from him. He is lost. I am not. His voice came out wrong. Too quiet, too desperate. Revka, please. You were lost 4 years ago. Nothing has changed. The boy shifted behind her, pressing closer to her leg, one small hand reaching up to grip her fingers. Not out of fear. Anchoring. Like he understood something about this moment that even the adults had not fully grasped. She stepped back. The door began to close. Don't. The word stopped him, not because of its volume but because of what lived beneath it. Years of silence. Years of surviving without him. Years of teaching herself that the man in front of her was a door she had permanently sealed shut. The door closed. The lock turned. The sound was small, but it landed in his chest like something final. He lowered himself onto the stone step. The cold seeped through immediately, but he did not move. Inside, the girl's voice carried through the thin walls. Mama, why did the man say your name? Silence. Then Revka's voice, quieter, tighter, threaded with something she was trying very hard not to let the children hear. Because he thinks he remembers who I am. Does he? And Revka did not answer. Outside, the most powerful man in 4 territories pressed his hands together between his knees, and a truth settled into him so deep it would never leave. The worst thing he had ever done was not the violence, or the blood, or the enemies he had buried. The worst thing he had ever done was walk out of a room 4 years ago and believe that the woman he loved would still be there when he decided to come back. She wasn't. And now the only door that mattered was locked, and the only voice that could open it belonged to a woman who had taught herself to live as though he had never existed. The night everything shattered did not begin with the argument. It began weeks before, in whispers I was too trusting to hear for what they were. I loved him. That is not a confession. It is a fact, the same way gravity is a fact. From the first night Riven brought me into his world, I understood what he was. I saw the men who deferred to him, the weight his name carried in rooms where silence was more dangerous than shouting. And I stayed, not because I was trapped, but because, when the doors closed and the world fell away, the man I saw was someone no one else was allowed to see. Gentle, deliberate, the kind of quiet that came from strength, not from absence. For 3 years, I trusted what I could not see. The estate was beautiful in the way that powerful things often are. Cold marble softened by carefully designed light. Rooms that stretched further than 2 people could ever need. Gardens where I walked alone most mornings, listening to birds that had no idea they were singing inside a fortress. I made it mine, slowly, carefully, and when he came home, when his hand found the small of my back and his voice dropped to the register that belonged only to me, I believed I was exactly where I was supposed to be. That was the life Hadric walked into. Not suddenly, but gradually, like fog moving through an open window. Hadric had been Riven's second for longer than I had been his wife. A tall man with careful hands and a voice that always sounded like reasonable advice. He was polite, measured, and respectful on the surface. I had no reason to distrust him. It started with small comments. A mention of another man whose wife had been relocated after she learned too much. A quiet observation that Riven had been meeting with specialists without explaining what they specialized in. A pause after I asked where Riven had been that lasted just long enough to plant something I did not yet have a word for. Doubt. The stories kept coming, and they always ended the same way. The wife disappeared, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes not. Then I found the file. Riven had been away for 2 days. I had gone into his private study looking for a book. The drawer was not locked. It should have been, and later I would understand why it wasn't. But in that moment, I only saw what was inside. A folder with my full name on it, printed cleanly on a pale tab, the kind of label you put on something being tracked. Inside were photographs of me, walking through the garden, leaving the front gate, sitting in the car outside a shop, each one time-stamped, annotated with locations and durations, as though someone had been mapping every step I took. There were notes I could not fully understand, shorthand that looked operational, clinical, the language of people who moved through the world without being seen. My hands did not shake. That detail still stays with me, the strange calm that settles in when fear bypasses the body entirely and goes straight to something deeper. He came home that night, late, distracted. I watched him move through the bedroom, removing his coat, and I tried to see the man I had married inside the body of someone who might be planning to erase me. Fear does not wait for strategy. What is the file in your study? He turned slowly. His expression shifted from fatigue to something guarded, and that shift alone confirmed everything I was afraid of. What were you doing in my study? What is my name doing in a surveillance folder, Riven? Silence. It lasted no more than a few seconds, but it stretched wide enough to swallow everything I had believed about us. You do not understand what you saw. Then explain it. He did not. He stepped toward me instead, his voice dropping to that low, controlled register that I had once found comforting and now felt like a cage closing around me. That room is not for you. Those files are not for you. You need to trust me. Trust you. You are tracking me, photographing me, and you want me to trust you." His jaw tightened. His eyes changed. And I watched the gentleness I had loved drain out of them, replaced by something harder, something that belonged to the man the rest of the world feared. "If you cannot trust the person you married, then maybe you never understood what this life requires." The words landed like a blade, not shouted, spoken with a calm that made them worse, because calm meant he believed them. He waited for a response. When none came, he picked up his coat with movements that carried the finality of a man who had already decided his next step. "I will be at the North Office. When I come back, we will discuss this properly." He walked out. The front door closed. A car engine turned over, pulled away, and faded into the kind of silence that exists only when you are completely alone in a building designed to hold an army. I stood in the bedroom and felt, with a certainty that was absolute, that if I was still in this house when he returned, I would not leave it again. Not by choice. I did not sleep. The house settled around me the way large houses do at night, creaking and shifting as though it had its own restless thoughts. I sat on the edge of the bed, my mind running through every possible version of what came next. Every version ended the same way. The decision arrived the way certainty always does. Quietly, completely, like a lock turning inside my chest. I stood up and began to move. One bag. Plain canvas from the back of the closet. 2 changes of clothes. Simple and dark. A pair of shoes that could handle distance. My mother's ring, small and silver, the only thing I owned that had existed before him. Cash I had kept hidden in the lining of a coat I never wore. Because some instinct I had never fully listened to had always known that a woman living inside another person's power should keep something that belonged only to her. The estate was never empty. Guards rotated along the perimeter. Cameras watched every corridor and entrance. Every obvious exit was monitored, recorded, stored on servers that fed directly into the security office. But I had lived here for 3 years, and in 3 years, you learn things no one teaches you on purpose. I knew the service corridor behind the eastern kitchen connected to a maintenance passage beneath the garden wall. I knew the passage exited through a utility door that had been broken for months. I knew the camera covering the southeast garden had a blind spot between the fountain and the hedge line that lasted exactly 11 seconds during its rotation. 11 seconds was enough. I moved through the house like someone who had always planned to leave it, even though I never had. My footsteps were soft, measured, placed on the parts of the floor I had memorized as silent during hundreds of nights when sleep had not come and walking had been my only companion. The kitchen smelled of cold stone and the faint trace of the evening meal that still lingered in the walls. I passed through the narrow service door, into the corridor that smelled like dust and copper pipes and the underground dampness that expensive buildings try to hide beneath their polished surfaces. The utility door opened with a sound so quiet it barely registered above my own breathing. Cold air rushed in and hit my face like a warning and a welcome at the same time. Outside, the estate grounds stretched dark and still. The security lights created pools of harsh white that made the shadows between them seem deeper and more solid. I stayed in those shadows, counting steps, counting seconds, counting the rotations I had watched from the bedroom window on nights I could not sleep. The fountain, the hedge line, 11 seconds. I moved and did not stop until the wall was behind me and the ground changed from manicured stone to rough, uneven earth. The service vehicle's engine started on the first try. I pulled out slowly, no headlights, using only the ambient glow from the estate's perimeter to guide me along the gravel service road. When I reached the public road, I pressed the accelerator and felt something I did not expect. Nothing. No grief. No anger. Just blank, focused stillness, as though my body had decided that emotion was a weight I could not carry and survive at the same time. The fuel lasted longer than I expected. When the engine finally stuttered, the city was far behind me, replaced by open land and dark sky. I left the car on the shoulder of a road I could not identify and kept walking. My legs ached. My lungs burned. My fingers had gone numb. But I did not stop because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling, and feeling meant confronting the possibility that I had just made the biggest mistake of my life or saved it. Somewhere between one step and the next, a single thought crystallized with a clarity that cut through everything else. I was alone. Entirely, irreversibly alone. No name, no protection, no place in the world expecting me. Just a woman on a road with a canvas bag and the fading memory of a life that had closed behind her. And for the first time since I opened that drawer, something flickered through the emptiness. Not fear, not sadness. Something harder, something older. Survival. I did not know where I was going. All I knew was that behind me, a man who had never lost anything that mattered was about to wake up and discover that the one thing he had taken for granted had decided, quietly and without permission, to disappear. And by the time he understood what that meant, I intended to be someone he could never find. I walked for 2 days before the land decided I had gone far enough. The roads narrowed and vanished, replaced by dirt paths between hills of brown grass and scattered stone. I passed through places that were not quite towns, clusters of houses with smoke rising from chimneys, and dogs that watched from porches but never barked. No one spoke to me. I looked like what I was, a woman moving away from something. On the second evening, just as the last gray light drained from the sky, I came over a low ridge and saw it. Cressfield. Not a town, really. More like an agreement between a handful of buildings and a single road. A church with a steeple that leaned left, a post office that doubled as a general store, cottages built by people who cared about keeping the rain out, not impressing anyone. No cameras, no black cars, no men tracking movement they were paid to notice. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that settles when the world has forgotten a place exists, and the people who live there have decided that being forgotten is not a punishment but a gift. I stood at the edge of it for a long time, my bag heavy on my shoulder, my feet raw inside shoes that had not been designed for the distance they had carried me. I waited for something to feel wrong, for some instinct to tell me to keep moving. Nothing came. Instead, something loosened inside my chest. Not relief exactly, but a small, quiet exhale I had been holding for 2 days without realizing it. I walked into Cressfield the way you walk into water. Slowly, carefully, letting it close around me one step at a time. The greenhouse was at the far end of the main road, set back behind a low stone wall covered in moss. A long structure of old glass panes held together by iron framing turned green with age. Inside, even from the road, I could see color. Deep greens, flashes of violet and white, life insisting on existing even when everything around it had gone dormant. The woman who owned it was standing outside, pulling dead leaves from a climbing vine with bare hands. She was older than me by 20 years, broad-shouldered, with silver hair cut short, and eyes that held the particular sharpness of someone who had lived long enough to stop being surprised. "You need work," she said. Not a question. I nodded. She looked at my shoes, my bag, and the exhaustion I could no longer hide. Then she looked at my face, and something passed between us that I would later recognize as the kind of mercy that exists only in people who have needed it themselves. "Dagny," she said, extending one soil-darkened hand. "Revka." She did not ask where I came from. "We open before sunrise. The cuttings need watering at first light. There is a room above the supply shed. It is small, but it is warm. No paperwork, no references, no trail. Just an offer extended with the efficiency of someone who had learned that people in trouble needed solutions, not questions. The room was small, warm, and clean. A bed with a quilt that smelled of cedar. A chair by a window overlooking the greenhouse and the hills beyond. A door with a lock that answered only to me. I sat on the bed and pressed my hands against my face and breathed. For the first time in days, I was still. I should have felt safe. Part of me did. But there was another part, deeper, sharper, the part that had memorized camera rotations and counted seconds between security sweeps that knew better. Men like Riven did not lose things, they recovered them. I told myself I had been careful. I told myself this place was too small, too far, and too meaningless to appear on a search grid. I told myself 100 things that sounded like logic but felt like hope. And hope, I had learned, was the most dangerous thing a woman in my position could carry. The days took shape slowly. I learned the rhythms of the greenhouse, the way cuttings taken at the wrong time would refuse to root no matter how carefully you treated them. My hands learned soil, stems, the ache of hours that asked everything of your body and nothing of your past. Dagny did not speak much. She never asked about before. She simply let me exist. And in that space, something I had not felt in a long time began to take root. Not safety, not yet, but the possibility of it. And then, 3 weeks after I arrived, I woke before dawn with a wave of nausea so sudden and so violent that I barely made it to the edge of the bed before my body turned itself inside out. I told myself it was exhaustion. The weeks of walking, the sleepless nights, the stress that had wound itself so tightly it had found a way to demand attention. I told myself a dozen things that let me get through the morning without confronting what some deeper part of me already knew. The nausea came back the next day, and the next. Always in the early hours. Always sharp enough to leave me gripping the nearest surface. Dagny noticed, but said nothing. She simply placed a cup of ginger tea beside me each morning and went back to her work. By the end of the second week, I could not pretend anymore. The doctor was a woman named Petra, older, unhurried, with hands that moved with the calm precision of decades. She asked simple questions. I gave careful answers. She did not push when my silences stretched. "You are pregnant," she said. The words hung somewhere between my ears and my chest, suspended in a space where understanding had not yet agreed to meet them. How far along? 8 weeks, perhaps 9. 8 weeks. I counted backward and arrived at a date that placed this child's beginning in the same house I had fled, in the arms of the same man whose name I was trying to erase. I walked back through Cressfield slowly, pregnant, not just running anymore, growing something inside me that was half his, a living, undeniable connection to everything I had left behind. The thought stopped me in the middle of the road. Everything changed. Every calculation, every precaution was now more complicated, more fragile, and more permanent. This was not just my disappearance anymore. This was a child who would carry his blood, his features, his legacy in their bones, whether I wanted it or not. And if he ever found out, it would not just be me he came for. The months that followed moved in a way I had never experienced before. Time became physical, measured not in days or weeks, but in the changes happening inside my body, changes that demanded attention and care, and a tenderness I had not known I was capable of giving myself. Dagny knew before I told her. She adjusted my duties without comment, making sure I ate, placing a second cushion on my chair. She never asked who the father was. Petra confirmed what I had not expected. Not one child. 2. Twins. 2 lives where I had prepared for one. 2 reasons for him to come looking. They arrived on the quietest night of the year. The first heavy snow covered Cressfield in a silence so deep it felt like the world had decided to hold still. Dagny drove me to Petra's clinic, her hands steady on the wheel. The girl came first, loud, fierce, immediate. Her cry had no patience in it, no hesitation, just pure, unfiltered arrival. Petra placed her on my chest, and I looked down into a face that was impossibly small and impossibly familiar. Gray eyes, pale and sharp and unmistakable. His eyes. My breath left me. No matter how far I ran, he was here. In her face, in the way she gripped my finger, with a strength that felt inherited from someone built to hold the world in place. The boy came minutes later, quieter, almost reluctant, as though he needed to observe the room before committing to being part of it. Dark hair, warm eyes, a stillness that felt impossible for something so new. When they placed him beside his sister, he simply settled, calm and certain. I named her Veda, knowledge and strength. She would need both. I named him Caius, old and quiet and built to endure. I held them both against my chest and listened to their breathing and felt something rearrange inside me at a level so fundamental I would never be the same. I loved them completely, terrifyingly, without condition. And that love did not erase the fear. It sharpened it, refined it, turned it into something with edges I could feel pressing against the inside of my ribs every time I thought about what their existence meant. Because these were not just my children, they were his heirs. And in his world, heirs were not gifts, they were assets, they were leverage, they were reasons to send men who did not stop. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering Crestfield in quiet white that made the town feel like it existed outside of time. But snow melts. It always does. And when it does, the paths it covered become visible again. He came back at 7 the next morning, the way he always did after an argument, controlled, measured, and prepared to have the conversation he believed they both needed. He had every word planned, every response anticipated. None of it mattered. The house was empty. Not empty the way a large house feels when someone is in another room. Empty in a way that changes the air itself, that turns silence into something with weight you can feel pressing against your skin. The closet was untouched. Every dress, every pair of shoes remained. Nothing expensive was missing. Just her. And one canvas bag he had never paid attention to, and the small silver ring that had belonged to her mother. She had taken nothing of his. The precision of that choice settled into him with a coldness that had nothing to do with temperature. The first hour was denial. By the second hour, the denial was gone. Security logs showed no record of her leaving through any monitored exit. She had moved through the house the way his enemies studied it, finding gaps and blind spots that existed because no one had ever imagined they needed to be watched from the inside. He sent men within the hour, his best. They found the service vehicle abandoned 80 kilometers east, wiped clean, fuel tank empty. Beyond that point, the trail dissolved into nothing. She had stepped out of the car and into open country and ceased to exist. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The search consumed resources that should have gone to the operations keeping his empire intact. Alliances strained. Men who had once stood confidently before him began to avoid his eyes. Hadrick remained close through all of it. Steady, reliable, managing the search teams, filtering information with the efficiency of a man who had spent years learning exactly how his employer thought. And that was the problem, though it would take Riven far too long to see it. The shift began with exhaustion, not suspicion. After months of dead ends, Riven stopped looking outward and started looking back. The file, her name on the folder, the photographs. He had not put that file in the study drawer. The realization arrived quietly, in the space between one thought and the next. That file belonged in the secure room on the lower level, locked behind biometric access. It was part of a protection protocol he had commissioned 6 months earlier, designed to monitor her movements for safety, not control. Every photograph and timestamp existed because he had wanted to ensure that if anyone tried to reach her, his people would see it coming. It was never meant for her eyes. Someone had moved it. He went through the access logs. Hadrick had accessed the secure room 11 hours before Revka found the file. No logged reason, no report. And in the security footage from the study corridor, a 4-minute gap at exactly the time the file would have needed to be placed. 4 minutes. Scrubbed clean. By someone with authority to edit the system. Riven began to pull threads. He traced Hadrick's communications, finances, and movements. He found patterns where there should have been none. Meetings with unknown contacts. Transfers through accounts that existed only on paper, and beneath it all, a name appearing with increasing frequency. Barova. A rival family. Patient, strategic. They understood the fastest way to destroy a man like Riven was to remove the one thing that made him human. The confrontation happened in a room with no windows, in a building that did not officially exist. Hadrick did not deny it. The evidence was complete. Riven asked only one question. Did you know she would run? Hadrick's answer was the last thing he ever said in a room with Riven. I counted on it. The Barova family unraveled over the following months. Hadrick disappeared the way people disappear when they have been erased by someone who understands that true punishment is not pain, but absence. It should have been enough. It was not, because she was still gone. And the truth that everything she believed was built on a lie planted by someone he trusted did not bring relief. It brought a weight so heavy that some mornings he could not stand beneath it. She had run from a lie, and he had lost her to a truth he never got the chance to explain. That was when the search changed. No longer wide and desperate, focused, singular, stripped of everything except one objective: find her, not to take her back, just to stand in front of her and say the one thing 4 years had not allowed him to say. It was not what you thought, and I never stopped looking. It happened because of a photograph in a regional newspaper that fewer than 300 people had ever read, a feature on autumn markets in the northern valleys. Small towns celebrating harvests with tables of produce and handmade goods. She was not the subject. She was barely in the frame, a figure behind the main row, partially obscured by a display of potted herbs, her face turned just enough to catch the light. Hair shorter than any photograph he had on file, expression belonging to a version of her shaped by years he had not been part of. His analyst almost missed it. Something about her posture caught his eye, something about the way she held her shoulders that did not match the casualness of the scene around her. He ran it through 3 systems before sending it forward. The message arrived without commentary. No explanation was needed. When the image opened on Riven's screen, the room around him ceased to exist. He stared at it for a long time. Longer than a man who prided himself on decisive action should have allowed. The resolution was not perfect. The angle made certainty difficult for anyone who did not know her the way he did. But he did know her. He knew the way she stood, the way she held space, the way her body carried itself even in stillness. What he saw was not a possibility. It was a fact. She was alive. She was in a place called Cressfield. And she had not been erased from the world the way he had feared in the darkest hours of the years without her. His first instinct was familiar. Send men. Establish surveillance. He dismissed it before the thought was fully formed. Years of sending men had produced nothing except distance. Distance from her, from the truth, from the version of himself that might have been able to stand in front of her and be something other than a title. He stood without speaking. The room shifted the way rooms always shifted when he moved with that particular energy. Conversations dying, eyes lowering, bodies adjusting to the signal that whatever was about to happen was not something anyone could interfere with. He drove alone. No escort, no advance team, no contingency plan beyond the simple act of arriving. The city fell away, replaced by roads that narrowed and roughened and eventually surrendered to terrain that existed only because no one had seen reason to improve it. The drive took hours. He did not stop. The landscape changed around him, hills rising, trees thickening, and the air through the cracked window growing colder and sharper with every mile. He was leaving his world and entering hers, and with every kilometer the distance between what he controlled and what he did not became more obvious. Cressfield appeared the way small towns do after hours of emptiness, a cluster of shapes against a valley floor, modest and completely indifferent to his existence. He parked at the edge of town in the last dark hour before dawn. The engine died, and the silence that replaced it was total. The kind of silence that belongs to places where people sleep without guards and wake without checking perimeters. He found the cottage the way instinct finds what it has been searching for, not through logic, not through information, but through something deeper that had been pointing in this direction for 4 years without knowing it. He stood at the end of the stone path and waited. Mist gathered around him. Cold settled into his coat. Light glowed behind thin curtains. The door opened, and everything he had prepared for vanished the moment he saw her face. And then, the children, two of them, standing beside her like they had always been there. The girl's gray eyes hit him first, then the boy's quiet stillness. And the door closed again, the same way it had closed at the beginning of a story he was only now understanding he was living inside. But this time, he did not leave. He did not leave that day, or the next, or the day after that. The town registered it with slow, quiet curiosity. A man who did not belong in Crestfield had taken up residence on the front step of a cottage, and he showed no sign of moving. He sat the way men sit when they have nothing left to negotiate, elbows on knees, eyes fixed on a door that did not open. Inside, Revka felt his presence the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. Not through sight or sound, but through something older, something wired into the part of her that had spent 4 years learning to detect threats in spaces that were supposed to be safe. She moved through the cottage with deliberate calm, preparing meals, tending to the children, maintaining the rhythms of a life built to function without interruption. But there was an interruption now, sitting 6 feet from her front door, refusing to become something she could ignore. Veda broke first. She was not built for patience or closed doors. By the second morning, she had positioned herself at the window, watching him with a frank, assessing gaze. "He is still there, Mama. I know. Is he waiting for something?" Some people do not know when to leave. Veda considered this seriously. Maybe he is not trying to leave. Maybe he is trying to stay. The words landed in a place Revka had not prepared to defend. Caius said nothing. He watched his mother instead, tracking the tightness in her shoulders, the way her grip changed on the spoon, the slight pause in her breathing after Veda spoke. He did not understand what was happening, but he understood her. Dagny walked past on the second afternoon and stopped to study Riven with the expression she used to assess plants that might or might not survive transplanting. "You are Riven," she said. "Not a question. She told you." She did not have to. A woman does not learn to disappear that completely unless something worth disappearing from taught her how. She crossed her arms. "I am not going to ask if you deserve to be here. That is not my decision. But I will tell you this. If you are here to take something that does not belong to you, this town will know before you do." He held her gaze. "I am not here to take her back." "Then what are you here for?" The answer took longer than it should have, not because he did not know it, but because saying it out loud made it real in a way that sitting silently on a step did not. "To be here, for as long as she will let me." Dagny studied him, then picked up her seedlings, and continued without another word. On the third morning, Revka stepped out for firewood. Their eyes met across the porch. She did not speak. He did not move. Then she went back inside, but the door did not lock behind her. He heard the difference. The click that had been there before was absent. Not an opening, a question she had not yet decided the answer to. That afternoon, Veda appeared at the window. She opened it, just a crack. "Are you cold?" He looked up at those gray eyes that could have been pulled from his own reflection. "A little." She disappeared. A minute later, the front door opened, and a small hand pushed something onto the porch. A knitted scarf, slightly uneven, made of dark green wool that smelled faintly of the greenhouse. The door closed fast, as though the act of giving had used up all the bravery available for one day. He wrapped the scarf around his neck and felt something crack inside him, something locked for 4 years giving way under a kindness so small and so enormous that no amount of power could have produced it. Those hands had signed orders that changed the shape of cities. They had held weapons and documents and the futures of men who would never know how close they came to losing everything. And now they held a rough green scarf made by a child who did not know his name, and it mattered more than all of it combined. Inside, watching through the curtain she thought he could not see past, Revka pressed her hand against her mouth and closed her eyes. Because her daughter had just done the one thing she had been trying to prevent. She had let him in. Not through the door, through something much harder to close. She came out on the 4th evening. The light was fading, and she stepped onto the porch with her arms crossed and her expression set in the careful, controlled way that told him she had prepared for this deliberately, thoroughly, with no room for anything she could not manage. He did not stand. He had learned that the distance between them was not his to close. "You need to explain something to me," she said. Steady, but with an opening beneath it that had not been there before. "That file. My name. The photographs. Tell me what I was looking at." He exhaled slowly. Protection. It was a protection protocol. A flicker passed behind her eyes before careful neutrality replaced it. "You had me followed, photographed, logged, like I was a target, like you were someone worth protecting. I commissioned it 6 months before that night. Your routes, your patterns, all mapped so that if anyone ever tried to reach you, my people would see it before it happened." "And the file in your study?" "It was never in my study. It was stored in the secure room. Biometric access. 2 people had clearance. Me and Hadrick." The name landed between them like something dropped from a height. Hadrick moved it. "He placed it in the drawer where you would find it, on a night when he knew I would be away long enough for you to discover it alone. Because he needed you to run. He needed you to believe I was dangerous to you. And he needed me to lose the only person who made me something other than what my enemies could predict." Her arms tightened across her chest. The air between them felt like it was being compressed, forced into a space too small to hold everything it contained. "Why?" "He was working with a family called Barova. They had been cultivating him for years. They understood that the fastest way to dismantle what I built was to hollow it out from within, and the most efficient way to hollow me out was to take you." Silence. Long and heavy. "Those comments he made to you," Riven continued. "The stories about other men's wives. The hints. The insinuations. None of that was accidental. He was building the frame before he hung the picture." Every conversation with Hadrick replayed in her mind. Every carefully placed word, every pause that had lasted just long enough to plant what she had mistaken for her own intuition. "4 years," she said, her voice stripped of armor. "4 years I have lived believing you were going to have me killed. I know. 4 years of raising them alone." Her voice cracked. "Of not knowing if I was protecting them or punishing them by keeping you away. You were protecting them. With what you believed, you did exactly what you should have done. And what I believed was a lie." "Yes." The words sat between them, simple and devastating. Inside, she could hear Veda narrating something to Caius. Their children, born in a town that existed because she had believed a lie. Where is he now? Gone. The family he worked with? Gone. The anger was still there. It would always be there. Not the white-hot fury of discovery, but something more permanent, a scar that had healed wrong and would never fully straighten. But its direction had changed. The man on her step was not the source. He was the other target. They had both been hit, just from different angles. "I do not know what to do with this," she said. His expression held something she had not seen before. Not patience or control. Something more exposed. The kind of honesty that powerful men do not survive long enough to learn. "Neither do I, but I am not going to figure it out from anywhere else." She did not invite him in, but she sat down on the opposite end of the step, arms still crossed, guard still up, but she stayed. And in the language of 2 people who had spent 4 years on opposite sides of a lie neither of them had built, staying was the first word of something that did not yet have a name. The storm came 3 weeks later. 1 hour the sky was still, the next the wind had teeth and the snow fell in sheets so thick the cottage windows turned white. By nightfall, the power was gone. The heating unit groaned and went silent. The temperature dropped fast enough to turn discomfort into danger within the hour. Revka moved quickly. Blankets from every shelf, the children bundled on the couch, the fireplace fed with the last of the wood. But the fire was not enough. Veda pressed against her side, unusually quiet, shivering. Caius sat perfectly still, watching the fire with dark, serious eyes, retreating into the kind of focus he used when something frightened him and he refused to show it. She did not call Riven. She did not need to. He was there before the second hour. She opened the door and saw him standing in the snow, arms full of split firewood, and his face raw from the wind. He stepped inside and began building the fire before she could speak, hands moving with steady precision despite the cold. Veda watched from the couch, her shivering easing, then extended one small hand and touched his arm. "Your hands are cold." He stopped, looked down at her, and something in his face that had been held in place by years of discipline simply let go. She pulled the blanket wider. After a moment, he sat beside her. She leaned into him immediately, without hesitation, because it was cold and he was warm, and that was reason enough for a child who had never learned to be afraid of him. Caius took longer. He watched from the other end of the couch. Minutes passed. The fire crackled. Veda's breathing slowed into sleep. Then Caius stood, crossed the distance, and sat beside Riven on the opposite side. He did not lean in. He simply sat close enough that their arms touched. Riven barely breathed. He sat between his two children, one pressed against his side in trust, the other choosing proximity on his own terms, and felt something so far outside the architecture of power that had defined his life that he could only accept it for what it was. He was their father, and for the first time he was being allowed to feel it. Across the room, Revka watched from the kitchen doorway. This was what had been taken from them. Not by Riven, not by her, but by a man who understood that the most efficient way to destroy two people was to make each one believe the other was the enemy. 4 years of storms faced alone, of children comforted without a second pair of arms. She could not get those years back. But this moment was here, and it was real. The storm passed by morning. Riven had not slept. The children had, still pressed against him when the first light crept through the windows. Revka brought him coffee without being asked. Their fingers touched around the ceramic, and neither pulled away. "I am tired," she said quietly. Not a statement of defeat. A door opening. "I cannot do this alone anymore." "You do not have to." Veda stirred, blinking awake. She looked at him, then at her mother, then back. "You stayed," she said, with the absolute authority of a child who has decided something is fact. "I did." Caius woke slower. He looked at his father for a long moment. Then he reached up and placed his hand on Riven's, his small fingers resting against scarred knuckles that had once held an empire together and were now learning to hold something far more fragile and far more important. Revka watched, and something inside her that had been locked for 4 years, quietly, finally, turned. She stepped forward. The distance between them was no more than a few feet, the same distance that had separated them on that first morning. But it felt different now. Smaller. Crossable. She said the only thing that mattered. "The door is open." He understood. The door that had closed on a night 4 years ago, sealed with silence and distance and a strength that had kept her alive but also kept her alone, was open, and it would stay open. Not because the past had been erased, but because the future deserved a chance that the past had tried to steal. He stood slowly, lifting Caius with him. Revka took his free hand. Her grip was firm, the grip of a woman choosing not out of weakness, but out of strength to hold something else. They stood together in the doorway of a cottage in a town that did not exist on any map that mattered, with 2 children who carried pieces of both of them in every breath, and the morning light fell across them like it had been waiting for exactly this moment. The door stayed open. And for the first time in 4 years, neither of them needed it to be anything else.